On a mild spring afternoon, 18th of May, 1938, the windows of the nursery at 10 West 54th Street, New York City, stand half open above a courtyard where a chauffeur polishes a Packard. Inside, Mary Todhunter Rockefeller straightens the cuffs on a white layette, then smooths the corner of a small engraved card announcing the birth of her twins, Michael and Mary. The paper bears the same discreet typeface used for Rockefeller wedding invitations and philanthropic galas, a font of dynastic continuity cultivated since John D. Rockefeller Sr. began buying land at Pocantico Hills in the 1890s. In the family archive at Pocantico today, shelves of such correspondence chart marriages, mergers, and building projects in the careful script of an American dynasty. This card is only one more entry in that record, a ritual of announcement and expectation. As Mary places it in its silver tray, she pauses, adjusts her own gloves, and looks toward the window. The world awaiting this child is exquisitely padded. Its edges, however, are already sharp. By the late summer of 1902, smoke from the burned Parsons Wentworth house curled above Pocantico Hills, New York, where John D. Rockefeller Sr. had begun assembling what would become the estate known as Kijket, a Dutch word meaning lookout. The fire that destroyed the original house accelerated plans for a new structure designed by architects Delano and Aldrich, rising on terraces that overlooked the Hudson River with deliberate majesty. Formal gardens would follow, and eventually, galleries for modern sculpture selected with the same systematic attention that had built Standard Oil. Half a century later, young Michael Clark Rockefeller is photographed on those lawns. A small figure in short trousers and round glasses, standing beneath marble statues and bronze figures selected by his father, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who would enrich Kijket's collections with modern and primitive art, using the house as a stage for political hospitality and cultural diplomacy. The boy appears in family albums, squinting slightly against the Hudson light, one hand sometimes raised to adjust his glasses, a gesture that will become characteristic. Estate ledgers preserved in the Rockefeller Archive Center list the infrastructure of this childhood in precise columns. Gardeners maintaining miles of paths and hedges, chauffeurs for the fleet of cars, governesses supervising the children's routines, and private security ensuring that the hilltop remained undisturbed by the outside world that had made the family's fortune but must not intrude upon its leisure. The bureaucratic order behind the seemingly effortless elegance is meticulous. Nothing left to chance, everything maintained according to systems established over decades. Contemporary accounts describe Kijket as embodying what one visitor called what God would have built if only he had the money, a joke that captured both the estate's magnificence and the peculiar American blend of democratic rhetoric and dynastic ambition. For the Rockefellers, Pocantico was more than a country house. It was a landscape of moral instruction, a place where great fortune demonstrated its capacity to create beauty and order, to sponsor art and conservation, to exercise stewardship over land that might otherwise have been exploited or ruined. The narrator observes that this quiet hilltop, carefully insulated from the noise and disorder of the city where Rockefeller wealth originated, taught its heirs a particular lesson, that great fortune was a landscape to be continually managed, that privilege required performance, that their lives would always be lived under observation, if not by critics outside the gates, then by the weight of family expectation and dynastic memory. In those early photographs from the 1940s and early 1950s, Michael already adjusts his round glasses against the Hudson light, an unconscious gesture of a child learning how to see from inside a carefully framed view. The gardens around him are not wilderness, but nature edited according to aesthetic principles, each vista composed like a painting. The boy, who will later travel to some of the world's most remote regions, is being raised in one of America's most controlled environments, where even the trees have been selected and positioned according to a master plan. By the autumn of the 1940s, the Rockefeller twins were splitting their time between Pocantico weekends and Manhattan weekdays, a rhythm common among wealthy New York families whose country estates and city residences served different but complementary functions in maintaining their social position. In classrooms at the Buckley School on East 74th Street, where Michael enrolled as a young boy before eventually transferring to boarding school, the training of upper-class boys followed a precise curriculum, both written and unwritten, Latin drills and mathematics, chapel services emphasizing duty and humility, instruction in sportsmanship that channeled competitive impulses into appropriate forms. But beyond the official course catalog lay another education, equally systematic, the unspoken instruction that public comportment mattered as much as academic marks, that a Rockefeller must learn to carry his name with a peculiar combination of confidence and modesty, never flaunting wealth, but never apologizing for it either. The other boys at Buckley came from similar backgrounds, sons of bankers, lawyers, corporate executives, creating a peer environment where Michael's privilege was normal rather than exceptional, where the question was not whether one would attend an elite university but which one, not whether one would pursue a career but how to balance professional ambition with family obligations and philanthropic responsibility. Family routines extended the curriculum beyond school hours. Thank you notes for gifts and visits were written on heavy cream stationery with the family's Fifth Avenue address. Embossed at the top, each note supervised by Michael's mother or a governess to ensure appropriate tone and legible handwriting. Surviving correspondence from earlier Rockefeller generations, such as the letters between John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his son John D. Rockefeller Jr., preserved in family archives, shows how politeness functioned as both genuine affection and subtle discipline, how expressing gratitude became a moral exercise that reinforced lessons about obligation and reciprocity. At the dining table, whether at Pocantico or in the city, Michael learned to listen more than speak, to observe the flow of adult conversation before contributing his own thoughts, to frame opinions as modest observations rather than confident pronouncements. His father, Nelson, already pursuing political ambitions that would eventually lead to the governorship of New York and the vice presidency of the United States, modeled a particular style, gregarious but calculated, charming but always aware of effect, able to connect with voters and donors while never forgetting his position or theirs. The noise of the city, carriage wheels long since replaced by honking traffic, construction sites where new skyscrapers rose to challenge older landmarks, was filtered through the thick walls of townhouses and the hushed interiors of clubs where Rockefeller men had been members for generations. Inside these spaces, the modern world's acceleration was held at a distance, its disruptions managed and contained. Michael's childhood moved through rooms where light fell softly through heavy curtains, where servants appeared when needed and vanished when not, where wealth functioned as insulation against inconvenience and uncertainty. The narrator reflects that it was easy, in such surroundings, for duty to masquerade as preference, for the paths laid out by family expectation to feel like personal choice. For children of this world, character was less something discovered through trial and experiment than something curated through careful instruction and modeling, shaped from outside before inner life had much chance to assert itself. From early on, Michael's world taught him that the right words on the right paper could move institutions, that politeness was a form of power, that privilege carried obligations he was being trained to fulfill. By the early 1950s, the snow-covered campus of Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire became Michael Rockefeller's new stage, a transition from the protected spaces of Buckley and family homes to the slightly less insulated environment of elite boarding school. Founded in 1781, Exeter represented a particular tradition of American education, demanding academics combined with character formation, the belief that young men of privilege should be prepared for leadership through rigorous study and structured communal life. School records preserved in Exeter's archives note Michael as a student senator and a varsity wrestler, a combination of governance and physical discipline that matched the Rockefeller ideal of service, channeled through institutions and bodies made discipline through exertion. Wrestling, in particular, embodied values the school and family endorsed. Individual competition contained within strict rules, success achieved through training and technique rather than mere aggression, the cultivation of strength that could be deployed but must be controlled. The Exeter yearbook photographs from Michael's years show him among rows of other boys in dark jackets and ties, the uniform sameness of dress emphasizing that however different their family backgrounds might be, they were being molded into a common type, the educated gentleman prepared to assume positions of responsibility in government, business, and civic life. Michael's round glasses reflect winter light in these formal portraits. His expression is serious, but not severe, suggesting the earnest engagement expected of someone bearing his surname. Somewhere between these group photographs and the more intimate family portraits taken at Kykuit, a pattern emerges that will characterize much of Michael's public presentation. Leadership offered as if reluctant, authority exercised modestly, ambition present but carefully disguised as duty. This was the Rockefeller style, refined over generations. The understanding that in a democracy theoretically hostile to inherited privilege, dynastic families must perform their power as service and must appear to lead because circumstances demand it, rather than because they seek dominance. During school breaks, Michael returned to Manhattan where his father's cultural ambitions were crystallizing in new institutional forms. In 1954, Nelson Rockefeller opened the Museum of Primitive Art at 15 West 54th Street, housing works from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas in a townhouse gallery located conveniently across from the Museum of Modern Art, which the family had helped establish decades earlier. The museum's catalogs and exhibition records, preserved in various institutional archives, document a collecting philosophy that both celebrated non-Western artistic traditions and appropriated them according to Western aesthetic categories, removing objects from their original context to display them as art rather than as ritual implements or functional objects. Michael's holidays now included museum visits alongside estate weekends, creating an education that blended traditional upper-class pursuits, riding, sailing, formal dinners, with exposure to modern art and anthropology. He watched his father move through gallery openings and donor dinners, observing the choreography of cultural philanthropy, the strategic placement of guests, the brief speeches that balanced genuine enthusiasm with appropriate humility, the thank you notes written afterward to curators and collectors whose cooperation made exhibitions possible. The narrator reflects that in this family, education was never merely about schools attended or subjects mastered, but about learning how to convert wealth into influence without appearing to grasp for either. The ideal Rockefeller heir would pursue his own interests, art, politics, conservation, but those interests would somehow align with family tradition and institutional legacy. Individual passion channeled into forms that reinforced rather than challenged the family's position. When Michael later crossed the world to collect primitive art, he was following a map drawn in these polished rooms where African masks hung beside Picasso paintings, where non-Western cultures became objects of aesthetic appreciation filtered through distinctly Western frameworks of understanding. By June 1960, in Harvard Yard's sunlit quadrangles in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Michael Rockefeller graduated cum laude with an AB degree in history and economics, joining the ranks of Rockefeller men who had attended Harvard going back to his grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Jr. The commencement photographs from that day show rows of young men in dark robes and mortar boards, their faces pale under overcast skies, Michael among them, identifiable by his characteristic glasses catching the diffuse light as he looks toward a speaker on the platform. At Harvard, the polished etiquette of his upbringing found new application in seminar discussions and social networking. The university's culture of intellectual competition, its exclusive final clubs and strategic friendships, its blend of genuine scholarly inquiry and social positioning, functioned as another kind of finishing school. Michael studied under professors who moved between academic positions in government service, who advised corporations and sat on foundation boards, embodying the connections between knowledge and power that Harvard cultivated as carefully as its ivy-covered buildings. In letters written during his Harvard years, some preserved in family papers, others referenced in later biographical accounts, Michael expressed growing interest in anthropology and non-Western cultures, describing his coursework with engagement that suggested more than dutiful study. But he also articulated a tension that would shape his post-graduation choices, writing in one later explanation of his plans about the desire to do something adventurous at a time when frontiers, in the real sense of the word, are disappearing. The line reads, in retrospect, like an heir negotiating the boundaries of an inherited world, seeking something beyond what trust funds and institutional positions could provide. The phrase reveals assumptions embedded in his education, that adventure meant geographical and cultural distance from his own world, that frontiers existed primarily as stages for Western experience rather than as spaces already inhabited and meaningful to their residents, that a Rockefeller might pursue authenticity by leaving behind the constraints of his name and fortune, even as both enabled and shaped whatever adventure he might find. The sentiment was genuine. Michael's subsequent actions demonstrate real commitment and courage, but it was also characteristic of his generation and class. A romantic primitivism that sought renewal in distant places while remaining fundamentally grounded in Western categories and privileges. In dorm rooms at Harvard, he wrote letters home in the careful hand once used for childhood thank you notes, only now describing lectures on cultural relativism, discussions of colonial history, and the emerging discipline of visual anthropology that combined his interests in art and human difference. The handwriting remained neat and legible, the tone respectful and thoughtful, but the content suggested a young man beginning to imagine a life that diverged, however provisionally, from the expected paths of law school or business school, foundation leadership, or political office. The narrator observes that for many of Michael's classmates, these Harvard years represented an end in themselves, the culmination of preparation, the credential that would open doors to established careers in established fields. For Michael, with financial security guaranteed and family connections already providing access to any institution he might choose, Harvard was prelude rather than destination. Preparation for journeys whose purposes remained somewhat unclear even to him. His next classroom would have no walls or structured curriculum, only jungle and river and the complex negotiations of fieldwork among people whose lives had been disrupted by the same Western colonial expansion that made his own privileged mobility possible. In 1960, shortly after his Harvard graduation, Michael Rockefeller served for 6 months as a private in the United States Army, fulfilling the military service requirement that applied to young men of his generation despite the deferments and exemptions that wealth and family connections might have secured. The Army record from this period is modest: no officer commission despite his education and social position, no decorations or distinctions that would stand out in a family accustomed to major institutional roles and public recognition. Service records preserved in military archives show his basic training at an installation whose specific location remains unremarkable in official documents, his assignment to duties that required physical endurance and the capacity to follow orders rather than give them. For 6 months, the pattern of his life shifted from the rhythms of Pocantico and Harvard to the harsh routines of military discipline. Réveillé before dawn, close-order drill on parade grounds, barracks life where privacy disappeared, and individual identity dissolved into unit cohesion and rank structure. The experience marked a rare moment when Michael inhabited an institution not designed for him or his class, where his surname carried no weight and might even generate resentment, where he shared space with men from backgrounds profoundly different from his own. No diaries from these months have been made public, and Michael himself apparently left few written reflections on what military service meant to him, but later field notes from New Guinea suggest a man comfortable with discomfort, references to leeches and mud, to malfunctioning equipment and improvised repairs, to sleeping in conditions that would have seemed unimaginable in the context of his childhood. One can imagine him in some anonymous training ground in late 1960 America, perhaps Fort Dix in New Jersey or another northeastern installation, tightening a web belt and adjusting boots with military precision rather than folding gloves and straightening cuffs in drawing rooms, learning to pack a rucksack and field strip a rifle with the same systematic attention his family applied to managing estates and foundations. The Army taught skills he would never use in combat, but that translated to other contexts: how to function with minimal sleep, how to navigate bureaucratic hierarchies and secure needed supplies, how to maintain equipment under difficult conditions. The narrator reflects that the Army did not fundamentally rewrite Michael's destiny or transform his understanding of himself and his position. 6 months was too brief for that, and his return to civilian life too certain from the beginning. But it added a cadence of endurance to a life previously cushioned from physical necessity, introduced him to discomfort that came not from exotic adventure, but from institutional routine, and taught him that his body could be pushed beyond its accustomed limits. That endurance would matter 18 months later, when his last bed was the overturned hull of a catamaran in a rising sea, when all the refinements of his upbringing proved useless, and what remained was simply the question of whether he could keep swimming. By early 1961, back in Manhattan, Michael Rockefeller was working with his father's Museum of Primitive Art, helping to catalog and arrange works that challenged, at least in rhetoric if not always in practice, the old hierarchies of civilized and primitive, fine art, and ethnographic specimen. The museum's mission, as articulated by founding director Robert Goldwater and supported by Nelson Rockefeller's substantial financial backing, was to present non-Western objects as aesthetic achievements worthy of serious attention, rather than as curious artifacts of supposedly less developed cultures. In the townhouse galleries at 15 West 54th Street, Michael learned a new kind of etiquette: the protocols of acquisition and display, the careful language of object labels that had to navigate between anthropological context and aesthetic appreciation, the complex negotiations with dealers and collectors who mediated between source communities and Western institutions. Museum records and correspondence preserved in institutional archives reveal the mechanics of this work: acquisition proposals, condition reports, discussions of authenticity and provenance, decisions about what to display and how to present it to visitors who came seeking both education and aesthetic experience. Michael's hands, which had once moved across calling cards and thank you notes in learning the rituals of his class, now handled carved shields and ancestor figures, checking condition reports that documented every crack and repair, noting provenance that often traced circuitous routes from New Guinea or West Africa through colonial officials and missionary collections to European and American dealers. He studied photographs of Asmat bis poles and carved canoe prows sent from Dutch New Guinea, adjusting his glasses as he compared published accounts of ceremonial use with the decontextualized objects the museum hoped to acquire. The work was genuinely engaging. Michael's later actions demonstrate authentic interest rather than mere family obligation, but it also embodied profound asymmetries of power. Western institutions like the Museum of Primitive Art operated on the assumption that they could better preserve and appreciate objects than the communities that created them, that removing sacred implements and ritual carvings from their original contexts was justified by the goal of cross-cultural understanding and aesthetic education. The collectors and donors who funded such institutions rarely questioned whether their access to these objects depended on colonial structures that had disrupted indigenous societies and created markets for their cultural patrimony. Michael wrote letters during this period to anthropologists and curators, his correspondence careful and respectful, but operating within frameworks he had not created and perhaps did not fully recognize. The thank you notes he sent after successful acquisitions or helpful consultations followed the same refined forms he had practiced since childhood: gracious acknowledgments that maintained relationships and demonstrated proper appreciation. He was being trained to host cultures on museum walls, to facilitate encounters between Western audiences and non-Western art forms, a role that his family's wealth and institutional positions made possible. The narrator notes that in a world where Gilded Age heiresses had been trained to host salons and manage complex household staffs, this mid-century heir was being prepared to host cultural differences in institutional spaces, to make strange objects familiar to educated viewers while preserving enough strangeness to justify the museum's educational mission. It was refinement turned outward toward global cultures, but still anchored firmly in Manhattan, still operating according to Western assumptions about what art was and how it should be understood. To truly understand the art he was cataloging, Michael would eventually decide he needed to leave the gallery entirely and travel to the places where these objects originated, to witness the ceremonies and social contexts that gave them meaning beyond their aesthetic properties. In March 1961, Michael joined the Harvard Peabody expedition to what was then Dutch New Guinea, serving as a sound recordist for anthropologist Robert Gardner's ethnographic film Dead Birds, which documented the Dani people of the Baliem Valley in the territory's mountainous interior. The expedition's production notes, archived at Harvard's Peabody Museum, list Michael not as patron or sponsor, but as working crew, responsible for recording ambient sound, monitoring audio equipment, and carrying his share of gear through the mud and steep terrain of a highland trails. The film project brought together academic anthropology, documentary filmmaking, and the kind of cultural salvage work that had become common among Western scholars, convinced they were witnessing the last moments of primitive societies before modernization transformed them. Gardner's artistic vision aimed to create a poetic representation of Dani warfare and ritual rather than a straightforward ethnographic record, using cinematic techniques to make the Dani comprehensible to Western audiences according to universal human themes: conflict, mortality, the search for meaning. Each day in the Baliem Valley, Michael monitored recording equipment, adjusted microphone positions to capture chants and ceremonial speeches, and logged technical notes about sound quality and ambient noise. The valley's acoustic environment differed completely from anything in his previous experience. The sharp echoes of voices in mountain air, the rhythmic thud of pig slaughtering ceremonies, the specific tonalities of Dani language and song, the quiets between events when only wind and distant bird calls mark the passage of time. Production photographs from the expedition preserved in the Peabody archives show Michael behind equipment rather than in front of cameras, working rather than observing, his round glasses visible beneath a canvas hat as he checks recording levels. The images suggest genuine engagement. He appears focused on technical tasks, comfortable in roles that required competence rather than prominence. Unlike his father's highly publicized cultural initiatives, this work was relatively anonymous, valued for its technical contribution rather than for bringing Rockefeller prestige to the project. The narrator reflects that for the first time, perhaps, Michael's role was not to speak for his own world, but to record someone else's, to create documentary evidence that would outlast both the filmmakers and their subjects. The habit of adjusting his glasses, that characteristic gesture visible in childhood photographs and Harvard commencement portraits, now served a different purpose, shielding his eyes from tropical glare as he read meters and monitored equipment rather than reviewing account books or guest lists. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities his education had certainly cultivated, but deployed toward documenting lives utterly different from anything he had known. The film Dead Birds, which premiered in 1964 after Michael's disappearance, would become a landmark of ethnographic cinema, praised for its artistry, debated for its interpretive choices, and eventually critiqued for the ways it represented the Dani according to Western assumptions about violence and primitive humanity. Michael's contributions as sound recordist were technical rather than creative, but they enabled the project's completion, providing the audio track that gave the images their emotional resonance. Yet even here, working collaboratively on a documentary project with scholarly aims, his Rockefeller name ensured the money that kept cameras rolling and enabled the months of fieldwork required for Gardner's artistic vision. By October 1961, Michael had returned alone to the southern coast of Dutch New Guinea, traveling to Asmat country, a vast region of tidal rivers, mangrove swamps, and scattered villages where the Indonesian government and Dutch colonial authorities maintained only tenuous control. His purpose was dual: to collect carvings for his father's Museum of Primitive Art and to understand the social and ceremonial contexts that gave these objects meanings beyond their aesthetic properties. He established a base in Agates, a small administrative outpost that served as the regional center for the handful of Dutch officials, Catholic missionaries, and traders who represented external authority in the area. In letters later published in the Asmat of New Guinea, the Michael C. Rockefeller expeditions, edited by Adrian Gerbrands and compiled from Michael's field notes and correspondence, he described the work as thoroughly exhausting but most exciting, a phrase that captures both the physical demands of travel by dugout canoe and motor launch in equatorial humidity, and the intellectual engagement of documenting what he called a huge puzzle of ceremonial variations and stylistic differences across villages separated by a few miles of swamp but maintaining distinct artistic traditions and ritual practices. He traveled with local guides and translators, navigating rivers whose names appeared on no maps he had studied at Harvard, visiting villages where missionaries had recently established stations but where older ceremonial patterns still structured much of daily and ritual life. At each village, he negotiated for carvings, bis poles carved for specific memorial feasts, shields decorated with clan designs, canoe prows that showed the artistic styles of particular carvers and regions. The exchanges followed patterns established by earlier collectors and traders: steel axes, fishing hooks, cloth and tobacco from Michael, ancestor poles and sacred objects from Asmat men who saw opportunities to obtain valuable trade goods, while perhaps also moving spiritually potent objects out of circulation. The transactions were documented in field notes and shipping lists that recorded each object's village of origin, the circumstances of acquisition, and Michael's observations about ceremonial use and artistic significance. These records, preserved in museum archives, reveal the complexity and ambiguity of such collecting. Michael showed genuine respect and curiosity, learning what he could about Asmat cosmology and social organization, but the exchanges remained fundamentally asymmetrical. He was converting sacred objects into museum pieces, removing them from ceremonial contexts where they had meanings and functions impossible to preserve once they entered institutional collections. In his journal entries from this period, the handwriting grows looser and less controlled, ink blotting in the humidity, the refined script of his childhood thank you notes giving way to field notes written in difficult conditions. Yet the underlying patterns of his upbringing remain visible: careful descriptions attempting to be accurate and fair, respectful tone, acknowledging his informant's knowledge and expertise, systematic organization of information according to scholarly categories. The motif that has marked his life continues. Looking up from the page, he instinctively reaches to adjust his glasses, a gesture now made necessary by tropical glare and the physical demands of field work, but still recognizably the same movement photographed at Kikwit decades earlier. The final entries in his journal before 19 November 1961 express satisfaction with his collections and eagerness to continue the work, noting villages he hoped to visit and carvings he hoped to acquire. The tone is optimistic and forward-looking, suggesting no premonition that these would be his last written words. The next entry would be written by others, documenting not his observations, but his absence, attempting to piece together what happened in the hours after he left the overturned catamaran and swam toward a shore he would never reach. In late October and early November 1961, operating from Agates, Michael and Dutch anthropologist René Wassing, who was conducting his own field research in the region, persuaded a patrol officer to sell them a homemade catamaran, essentially two dugout canoes lashed together with a small outrigger motor. They loaded it with trade goods and set off along the Asmat coast, planning to visit villages accessible primarily by water, in a region where roads were non-existent and overland travel through swamp and jungle impractical for carrying the bulky carvings Michael hoped to collect. The expedition log, preserved in subsequent investigations and later publications, documents 13 villages visited over 3 weeks in November 1961. At each village, Michael engaged in what might be understood as a kind of courtship, presenting trade goods, observing ceremonies when permitted, photographing carvings and their social contexts, negotiating with village leaders and individual carvers for pieces he wanted to acquire. The transactions required patience and diplomacy, understanding which objects might be available for trade, offering appropriate compensation, navigating the complex social dynamics of who had authority to transfer items that often carried sacred significance or clan ownership. This was not marriage in the literal sense that had structured much Gilded Age history. No alliance sealed by wedding ceremony or legal contract. But it functioned according to comparable logic. Exchange between parties of vastly unequal power, one side offering manufactured goods and institutional prestige, the other providing cultural objects whose value the collecting party determined according to their own aesthetic and scholarly criteria. The asymmetry was obvious. Michael could leave whenever he chose, returning to New York with his collections, while the Asmat remained in circumstances shaped by Dutch colonialism and missionary intervention, their options constrained by forces beyond their control. The transactions were recorded in field notes and acquisition records that treated the exchanges as straightforward purchases. Specific objects acquired for specific trade goods, possession transferred from Asmat maker to American collector. But such documentation necessarily simplified more complex social negotiations, erasing the power dynamics and colonial context that made these transactions possible. Michael's genuine interest in Asmat culture did not eliminate these asymmetries. If anything, his scholarly intentions depended on them, requiring access and mobility that only Western privilege could provide in a region where Indonesian sovereignty was contested, and Dutch colonial authority enforced by occasional patrol boats and the threat of punitive expeditions against villages that resisted external authority. The narrator reflects that, like many Gilded Age unions negotiated in drawing rooms and documented in marriage settlements, this partnership between Rockefeller institutional power and Asmat ritual production was negotiated in the shadow of much larger forces. Dutch colonial administration gradually transferring authority to Indonesian government, Catholic missionaries working to replace traditional ceremonies with Christian practice, and the recent memory of violent encounters between Asmat villages and colonial forces. The 1958 punitive raid on Otjanep village, in which Dutch patrol officers had killed several Asmat men in retaliation for the deaths of a missionary family, remained vivid in local memory, a context Michael may not have fully understood as he traveled through the region with his trade goods and camera equipment. The balance of this fragile partnership, Western collectors seeking art, Asmat communities seeking trade goods, and perhaps also assessing this stranger who arrived alone in their villages, would tip decisively in a sudden storm off the coast. In mid-November, what had been a reasonably successful collecting expedition, producing hundreds of photographs and numerous carvings along with Michael's detailed field notes, would end in circumstances that transformed him from collector into mystery, from Rockefeller heir engaged in scholarly work into a name associated with dark speculation about cannibalism and colonial violence. On the morning of 19 November 1961, off the southern coast of Dutch New Guinea, near the mouth of the Ilandan River, a sudden squall struck the overloaded catamaran carrying Michael Rockefeller, Rene Wassing, and two young Asmat men who were assisting them as guides and translators. The small craft, riding low in the water with the weight of equipment and recently acquired carvings, could not withstand the combination of wind and waves that built quickly in the shallow coastal waters. The catamaran overturned, dumping all four men and their cargo into water that was warm but rough, far from any visible shore. For nearly 24 hours, Michael and Rene Wassing clung to the overturned hull while the two Asmat assistants set out swimming for shore, hoping to reach land and bring rescue. The sea itself was not dramatic in a cinematographic sense, no towering waves or violent storm, just persistent chop, equatorial heat, and the gradual exhaustion that comes from clinging to unstable wreckage while sun and salt water take their toll. Wassing, who survived to provide testimony about these events, would later describe their attempts to stay calm, to conserve energy, to wait for rescue that they hoped would come before their strength failed. At some point during that long day and night, Michael made a decision that Wassing tried to discourage but could not prevent. He fashioned improvised flotation devices from empty gasoline cans, strapping them to his waist, and announced his intention to swim for shore rather than wait any longer. According to Wassing's testimony, preserved in subsequent investigations and widely quoted in later accounts, Michael's last words before leaving the catamaran were simple and characteristic. "I think I can make it." The phrase contains everything of his upbringing compressed into 5 words: confidence in his own capability, self-reliance learned through years of training and education, faith in physical conditioning developed on wrestling mats and army training grounds, and perhaps also the Rockefeller assumption that determination and effort could overcome obstacles. It was a sentence almost polite in its understatement, suggesting tentative assessment rather than bravado, yet it expressed certainty about a decision that was essentially irreversible once he began swimming. No dramatic declaration, no moment of theatrical courage, just a practical judgment delivered in measured tones, as if he were announcing his departure from a dinner party, rather than attempting a desperate swim through open water toward a coastline he could barely see. The narrator observes that, in that moment, all the rehearsed rituals of his world, the polished manners learned at Pocantico, the diplomatic skills practiced at museum openings, the scholarly protocols followed in field work, became utterly useless. What remained was simply a body in water and a decision about whether to wait passively for rescue or attempt active survival. The choice he made reflected both courage and the particular kind of confidence his privilege had cultivated, the belief that his own agency and effort mattered more than circumstances beyond his control. As Michael pushed away from the catamaran, adjusting his glasses one final time before beginning his swim, the careful boundary between privilege and vulnerability that had protected him throughout his life finally dissolved completely. Wassing watched him swimming strongly at first, the gasoline cans providing buoyancy, his strokes steady and purposeful. Then distance and the angle of light made him impossible to follow, just a small dark shape moving through water that reflected tropical sun, heading toward a shore that may have been closer than it appeared, or may have been farther, heading toward an encounter whose details remained disputed and uncertain, becoming in that moment not a Rockefeller heir engaged in scholarly collecting, but simply a man swimming for his life through an indifferent sea. In the days immediately following 19th November 1961, Dutch colonial authorities and the Rockefeller family mounted an intensive search effort, fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters scanning the coastline, patrol boats searching mangrove channels and river mouths, ground teams questioning villages along the shore where Michael might have come ashore. Photographs preserved in news archives show Nelson Rockefeller and his wife arriving in New Guinea, wearing pressed tropical suits despite the equatorial heat, the careful grooming and controlled expressions of people accustomed to public attention, now strained by genuine distress and uncertainty. Search teams found no trace, no body, no wreckage beyond the catamaran itself, no reports from coastal villages of a European man arriving exhausted but alive. After 2 weeks of sustained effort involving military resources and substantial expense, Dutch officials announced on 2 December 1961 that there was no longer any hope of finding Michael Rockefeller alive. The official verdict, recorded in government documents and repeated in press statements, concluded that he had drowned during his attempted swim, that his body had been carried out to sea or consumed by crocodiles and sharks known to inhabit these waters. Yet, even as officials declared the case closed, rumors began spreading through the region and eventually reaching international media that Michael had reached shore alive, that he had been killed by Asmat villagers, that his death was connected to earlier violence between Dutch colonial forces and Asmat communities. The speculation proved impossible to suppress or definitively refute. The region was too remote, too many villages, too scattered and difficult to reach, too much mutual suspicion between Dutch authorities and Asmat populations who had no reason to cooperate with investigations that might lead to punitive consequences. In Otsjanep village, several miles from where Michael was last seen, rumors focused particularly insistently. This was the community whose men had been killed in the 1958 Dutch raid, deaths that remained unavenged according to Asmat customary practices that required violence to be balanced by counter-violence, that understood killing as creating debts requiring settlement. Some accounts suggested that Michael, if he reached shore near Otchenep, might have been killed in retaliation for those earlier deaths, not because anyone mistook him for the specific patrol officers responsible, but because he represented the same external world of colonial authority and Western intrusion that had disrupted Asmat life. Decades later, journalist Carl Hoffman's book, Savage Harvest, A Tale of Cannibalism, Colonialism, and Michael Rockefeller's Tragic Quest, would reconstruct events using oral histories, colonial reports, and interviews with aging Asmat informants who claimed direct knowledge of Michael's killing. Hoffman's account, published in 2014 after years of research in the region, suggests Michael was likely killed shortly after reaching shore and subsequently consumed in a headhunting ritual, not out of savagery or random violence, but according to Asmat cultural logic about vengeance and spiritual power, his death framed by local understandings of reciprocity and cosmic balance rather than by Western categories of murder or cannibalism. The narrator offers careful reflection. To the Rockefeller world and the broader American public, cannibalism represented unimaginable otherness, the ultimate marker of primitive savagery that confirmed the most fearful colonial stereotypes about non-Western peoples. To Asmat, if Hoffman's reconstruction is accurate, Michael's killing would have been a grim but rule-bound response to prior violence, an act embedded in complex understandings of spiritual power and social obligation that outsiders consistently misunderstood or dismissed. The truth may never be definitively established. The only certain Western witnesses are dead. Asmat testimonies are filtered through translation and decades of memory. And the political stakes of such accounts remain fraught for communities still managing relationships with the Indonesian government and international attention. Somewhere between these radically different interpretive frameworks lies a young man whose last documented words expressed hope rather than horror, whose final hours remain subject to speculation and competing narratives, whose body was never recovered and whose fate remains, in the strictest sense, unknown. What is certain is only the fact of his absence, the sudden transformation from promising scholar and collector into mystery and absence, his carefully planned expedition ending in circumstances his privilege could neither predict nor prevent. In 1964, 3 years after his disappearance, Michael Clark Rockefeller was legally declared dead by New York courts, a necessary legal formality that allowed the family to settle his modest personal estate and move forward with memorial plans. The official death certificate listed the cause as drowning, the simplest conclusion supported by the circumstantial evidence of his attempted swim and the failure to find any trace of him alive. The declaration allowed closure for legal purposes, while leaving unanswered the questions that would continue generating speculation and investigation for decades. In 1982, 21 years after Michael's disappearance, the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a substantial addition to one of the world's premier museums dedicated to housing arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. The wing's construction was funded by Nelson Rockefeller as a memorial to his son, transforming personal loss into institutional legacy, according to the family's long-established pattern of converting grief and obligation into philanthropic monuments. The collections included hundreds of works Michael had helped collect during his time at the Museum of Primitive Art and his New Guinea expeditions, Asmat carvings, Dani artifacts, objects from across the Pacific that he had handled, photographed, and shipped back to New York. By 2025, after a major renovation that modernized the galleries and updated interpretive materials to reflect changed scholarly understanding and ethical frameworks, visitors walk through bright, climate-controlled spaces where Asmat bisque poles and shields stand illuminated by carefully calibrated lighting. The objects are magnificent, tall ancestor poles with elaborate carving, shields decorated with clan designs in natural pigments, canoe prows that show individual artistic vision within cultural conventions. Museum labels now attempt to provide context about their original ceremonial functions, about the social circumstances under which they were created, and the complex histories that brought them to Manhattan. In one gallery, a glass case displays copies of the Asmat of New Guinea, the journal of Michael Clark Rockefeller, the book compiled from his expedition photographs and field notes, open to pages showing images he took in the weeks before his disappearance. The photographs show Asmat men holding carvings, villages along muddy riverbanks, ceremonies in progress, all captured through Michael's camera, according to his aesthetic and documentary choices. Nearby, exhibition texts attempt to outline the colonial context, Dutch presence in New Guinea, missionary efforts to suppress headhunting and traditional ceremonies, the punitive raids and administrative violence that shaped Asmat responses to outsiders. The narrator observes that museums, like the great estates of earlier eras, are architectures of privilege that can both illuminate and obscure. The Michael C. Rockefeller Wing preserves and displays objects of genuine artistic and cultural significance, making them accessible to visitors who would never travel to Asmat country and providing resources for scholarly study. But it also necessarily abstracts these objects from their original contexts, presenting them according to Western aesthetic categories and institutional logics that the Asmat makers would not recognize. The labels acknowledge colonial violence and cultural disruption, but the museum itself embodies a kind of cultural appropriation, however well-intentioned, however scholarly, that remains fundamentally asymmetrical. Some visitors pause at Michael Rockefeller's name on the wing's dedication plaques, perhaps aware of the tragic story that led to this memorial, perhaps simply noting it before moving on to examine the objects themselves. Others pass through the galleries without registering the name or its significance, drawn by the carving's visual power rather than by the history of their collection. Museum brochures include Michael's photograph, a friendly, serious face with round glasses, looking much as he appeared in Harvard graduation portraits, identified as the young collector whose passion for Asmat art made these collections possible. The official museum narrative presents Michael as a tragic figure, the promising young scholar whose genuine interest in other cultures led him to remote regions where he ultimately lost his life. This version emphasizes his courage, his intellectual curiosity, his respectful approach to field work, all true as far as they go, but inevitably simplifying the more complex realities of who he was and what his collecting work represented. Outside the museum's controlled galleries, the fuller story remains more ambiguous. A Rockefeller heir whose privilege enabled his travels and scholarship, whose genuine passion for art coexisted with the colonial structures that made his work possible, whose fate remains disputed, and whose final hours are subject to competing interpretations that reflect radically different ways of understanding violence, culture, and what constitutes justice. In the present day, researchers working in the Rockefeller Archive Center request access to family papers, boxes of correspondence between John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his son documenting the family's philanthropic philosophy, Nelson Rockefeller's memoranda about the Museum of Primitive Art's founding and collecting strategies, and documents related to Michael's disappearance and the subsequent search efforts. The archive, housed in a purpose-built facility at the Pocantico Hills estate, preserves the paper trail of dynastic wealth and institutional influence, making selected materials available to scholars while maintaining family privacy around more sensitive personal matters. Among the accessible documents are condolence letters written in 1961, 1964 to Nelson and Mary Rockefeller, their language blending Victorian restraint with mid-century psychological awareness, attempting to offer comfort for a loss that remained unnervingly uncertain. Some letters express conventional sympathy. Others struggle with how to acknowledge a disappearance that offered no body to bury, no definitive closure, only absence and unanswered questions. The Rockefeller responses, drafted with the help of staff but signed personally, maintained gracious dignity while revealing little of private grief. Decades later, in 2012, Michael's twin sister, Mary Rockefeller Morgan, published Beginning with the End, a memoir of twin loss and healing, adding her own voice to the family narrative and exploring the particular devastation of losing a twin brother whose childhood she had shared so intimately. Her account provides perspectives unavailable in official family communications, describing her experience of his absence and her decades-long process of accepting that he would not return, that the questions about his fate would likely never be answered definitively. The archive's reading room maintains the quiet reverence appropriate to spaces where history is preserved. The soft thud of archival boxes being lifted from shelves, the whisper of cotton gloves against paper, the hushed conversations between researchers and archivists. A historian working on a book about Rockefeller philanthropy opens a folder and finds a carbon copy of one of Michael's letters from New Guinea, the typewritten text faint but legible beneath decades of archival storage. The familiar phrase about frontiers appears again. The sentence about seeking adventure at a time when frontiers were disappearing, now transformed by context from youthful aspiration into ironic prophecy, a line suspended between worlds. The narrator reflects that in these underground shelves beneath Pocantico Hills, the architecture of privilege folds back on itself recursively. The same systematic record-keeping and institutional organization that projected Rockefeller power outward now preserves the documentary evidence of that power's limits. The careful correspondence and formal reports that once organized philanthropic initiatives and political campaigns now sit alongside documents that record uncertainty, loss, and the family's inability to determine what happened to one of its own despite enormous resources and institutional connections. Somewhere in these archival boxes, preserved according to professional standards that ensure their survival for future researchers, might be an itinerary listing Michael's departure from New York in early 1961, flight numbers and hotel reservations, contacts in Dutch New Guinea, shipping arrangements for the artifacts he expected to collect. The documents would show his careful preparation, his systematic approach to field work, his attention to logistical details that reflected both scholarly training and the organizational habits instilled by his upbringing. They would not record any premonition of danger, any awareness that this expedition might end differently than previous travels. The journey that began in that Fifth Avenue nursery in 1938, announced on engraved cards placed in silver trays, ends in these climate-controlled shelves. Correspondence, photographs, acquisition records, search reports, memorial announcements. The boy whose birth was documented in the formal language of dynastic continuity becomes, in the archive, a collection of folders and boxes, a name in finding aids, a subject for researchers who never knew him, but attempt to understand his life and death through the partial evidence that survives. The sound in the reading room is minimal. Turning pages, typing notes on laptops, the occasional quiet conversation about where to find particular documents. A researcher finishes reviewing a folder, carefully returns it to its box, and signals to the archivist that this box can be reshelved. The motion is practiced and respectful, acknowledging that these papers represent lives once lived, decisions once made, a family's private history now available for scholarly examination, but still demanding appropriate reverence. The small sound of the folder closing marks not resolution, but only the completion of one consultation, one researcher's work for the day. The archive will reopen tomorrow. The boxes will be requested again by different researchers with different questions, and the documents will continue offering their partial testimony about a life that ended, or perhaps merely transformed, in ways that remain ultimately uncertain and subject to interpretation rather than definitive conclusion. In a climate-controlled gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an azimuth bisque pole rises more than 15 feet toward the ceiling, its surface carved with elaborate figures representing ancestors and clan history, its form embodying cosmological principles about the relationship between living and dead, between this world and spiritual realms that frame azimuth understanding. Light from carefully positioned spots illuminates the carved surface, catching the grain of the wood and the subtle variations in color from natural pigments applied decades ago. Protective glass separates the object from visitors, maintaining climate control and preventing damage, creating a transparent barrier between contemporary viewers and this artifact from a profoundly different cultural context. The light glints off the protective glass, briefly catching the reflection of a visitor adjusting their own spectacles to read the exhibition label, a small, unconscious gesture that echoes the characteristic motion documented in photographs of Michael Rockefeller throughout his brief life. The label provides information about the Bispoles village of origin, approximate date of creation, ceremonial function in memorial feasts, and collection history that notes Michael Rockefeller's role in bringing this and similar objects to New York in 1961. The text attempts educational accuracy, explaining Asmat cosmology and artistic traditions without romanticizing or exoticizing, acknowledging colonial violence and cultural disruption while respecting the object's artistic achievement and ongoing significance to Asmat communities. At Pocantico Hills, several miles north along the Hudson River, Kickwitz terraces still overlook the same views that Michael knew in childhood. The river below, the Palisades rising on the opposite shore, the gardens that have been maintained according to the family's aesthetic vision for over a century. Tour groups now move through rooms where family portraits hang in formal succession, each generation documented according to conventions that have evolved from Victorian formality to mid-century casual elegance. Michael's portrait hangs among them, a young man with serious eyes behind round frames, photographed in the years before his New Guinea expeditions, looking much as he appeared at Harvard graduation or in early photographs from the Museum of Primitive Art. Tour guides provide brief biographical sketches as they move through the rooms, mentioning Michael's disappearance in New Guinea and the memorial wing at the Metropolitan Museum, offering just enough information to satisfy visitor curiosity without dwelling on the tragic and uncertain details. The guides' accounts emphasize his scholarly interests and cultural curiosity, framing his story as an example of Rockefeller's commitment to international understanding and cultural preservation. The darker possibilities raised by Carl Hoffman's research and by Asmat oral histories are not mentioned in these public tours. Too disturbing, too ambiguous, too difficult to present in the context of a brief, guided visit to a great house that markets itself as an American heritage site. Between these two locations, the museum gallery and the estate portrait room, nothing moves except tour groups and museum visitors. The living people who pass through these spaces according to visiting hours and ticketed schedules. The objects and images themselves remain static, arranged and rearranged by curators and preservationists whose work consists precisely of preventing change, maintaining collections according to standards of conservation and interpretation that evolve slowly across decades. The boy announced to the world on an engraved card in 1938 has become a name on museum walls and archival finding aids, his story inseparable from the objects and institutional structures that outlived him. No definitive answer is offered by these physical sites to the questions surrounding Michael's fate. The museum galleries present Asmat art as aesthetic achievement and cultural heritage, acknowledging colonial violence but not specifying Michael's potential role as its victim. The estate portraits present family continuity and philanthropic legacy, marking Michael's place in dynastic succession without dwelling on the circumstances that ended his life. Both locations preserve carefully curated versions of history, selecting and arranging evidence according to institutional purposes that serve present needs as much as historical accuracy. The narrator offers a final pairing of images without resolving their tension, an Asmat shield in climate-controlled light, its surface carved with designs whose meanings are partially documented and partially lost. A portrait of a young man whose fate remains similarly documented and lost, known and unknown. Between them lies no dramatic revelation, no comfortable morale, only the faint mark visible in old photographs where a thumb once pushed glasses back into place. A small gesture, repeated across decades, recorded in multiple contexts, now surviving only as visual echo in archived images that preserve appearance while concealing the interior life and final experiences that remain ultimately inaccessible to later interpretation and mourning.